Carpie lesson number 5, exposure. What do we do? So we've already said that for any given combination, there's a given combination within a bracket of light for any given film speed, which you're going to be able to get an exposure. And this exposure chart looks like this. So f16 is the highest aperture, the smallest opening, the smallest amount of light letting in. F8 is the greatest amount of light coming in unless you just hold the shutter open, which is the bulb or the B setting. And 1/500th is the fastest shutter speed. F2 is the largest. So anywhere along this line, you're going to have an exposure. But like, where along the line do you want to be? And that gets into the creativity of what you want to do. It's in super low light situations. This line is going to move down like this. In higher light situations, the line is going to move up like this. You could be in bright sunlight, and you may have you may have a setting of 1/500 and f8. But you need to understand exactly what these settings mean and what they do. So we'll have an example. Let's say that you're out in the country and you see a mountain, you see Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and you see Heather the Kitty. Now, Heather the Kitty is at 4 feet away, Mitch McConnell's at 15 feet away, and the mountain is at 1,000 feet away. Now, your inclination might be to just focus on whichever of these that you want to get, and that would be true. But you may be able to get all of these in focus depending on how bright the light is and what aperture you're using. Now, if you look on the Carpie lens, you're going to see, I don't know if this is focusing on here, you're going to see a little scale. Right above the f-stops, there's some numbers here which you probably don't really know what they mean. You'll see a 16, and then it scales down to this red line, and then back out to 16. What that is that gives you an indication of what's in focus for any given f-stop. For instance, you can see here the 16 is lined up with infinity, and the 16 is also lined up with about 8 feet. So here, if you're at f16, I should move the kitty a little further out. The kitty would be sort of in focus, but Senate Majority Mitch McConnell would be in focus, the mountain would be in focus. Now, you may not be able to use f16, the light may not be able to let you, but that's sort of what happens with aperture. And when you're looking through the lens, you're looking through the lens at a full f-stop of f2. More advanced cameras will allow you to see the actual depth of field, which is what it's called, meaning what's in focus and what's not. So chances are, if you're out in the sunlight and you're at an f5.6 or an f7 or an f8, you're going to have more in focus than what you see in focus in the camera. What you're focusing on is sort of the exact point of focus. Now that's the factor, that's the aperture factor. Then you have the shutter speed factor. And the shutter speed, you need to keep it high enough so that you can avoid camera shake. And the rule of thumb is the inverse of the the inverse of the focal length of the lens. And these are 50 millimeter lenses, which means basically they kind of see 1-to-1 of what the eye sees in terms of size. So if you use anything less than 1/60th of a second, let's say that it's very cloudy and you do want to get all of these things in focus and use a higher f-stop, then you can try to hold the camera really still and use maybe 1/15th of a second, but you might induce some camera shake. Also, when you're dealing with street photography, even that rule of thumb of 160, you need to bump it up a little bit. I shoot at about 1/250th of a second, basically, because half of the time I'm whipping up the camera, so you're inducing some more movement. In addition to the movement of the camera itself, there's the movement of the subject. So let's say that Heather the Kitty is rushing to get food, and you want to freeze the motion of Heather the Kitty. You want to use a higher shutter speed. So you're going to want to use something like 1/100th or 1/200th or 1/250th or something like that, which obviously means you need to focus closer on Heather because you're going to be using a higher f-stop and having less depth of field. So you may only have this area in focus at f2 or an f2.8 as opposed to if you had a higher f-stop. So that would be you freezing Heather in motion. Now let's say you want some sort of cool effect where you want Heather the kitty to have some blurred motion as she runs for food. Then you would want to use a lower f-stop, and you can use, or excuse me, use a lower shutter speed, and then you can use a higher f-stop. But that's sort of the interrelation of the two, and you need to kind of pay attention to that scale and get used to what that means and use it. I use it all the time in street photography, and there used to be a famous photographer that used to say f8 and be there, meaning that if you had an f8 f-stop on your camera for any given shutter speed you might use, then pretty much everything is going to be in focus. I think it's a little bit more like f11. But I very often, when I'm out shooting, I'll just use 1/250th of a second and say an f8 or an f11, and most everything is going to come into focus. Now, one of the the nice things about these particular lenses is they do have great bokeh, which is the out of focus subject isolating fuzz that you get that really you only can get with these sort of cameras. And you get the greater the lower the f-stop, the greater the opening, the more bokeh you're going to get, but also a very narrow depth of field. So let's say you want to take a portrait of someone and you want that blurred out background, and the light allows you to use the f2 or the largest opening aperture that you have, then you're going to be using a much higher f-stop, and you're going to, or excuse me, much higher shutter speed, and you're going to want to have them fairly close to the camera. And you can kind of play around with that. And the nice thing about the way that the focus works is you can see sort of the bokeh and the depth of field that you're going to get at the largest opening. But be aware that very often you may be focusing on something and you're going to get a lot more in focus than you have. So hopefully that was understandable. I bumbled a little bit. But bye-bye Heather the kitty and Mitch McConnell.